Good evening. Welcome to The Spy and the State with Jeffery P. Rogg. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum. Thank you so much for joining us in the theater or online. We really appreciate you. Jeff is a dear friend of the Spy Museum, and he is Senior Research Fellow at the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute. Previously, he was an assistant professor at the Joint Special Operations University, U.S. Special Operations Command, and the Citadel. He was also a postdoctoral fellow in the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. Jeff is the vice president of the Society for Intelligence History, and we hosted the conference here in February, which was amazing, and you can see some of the videos from that memorable event on our YouTube. And he is on the editorial board of the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. And tonight, former CIA museum historian and best-selling author of several intriguing books, Dr. Nicholas Reynolds, will be interviewing Jeff about Jeff's new book, The Spy and the State. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Okay, enough from me. Over to Nick and Jeff.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's great to be here. And I'm especially pleased to be here with my good friend, Jeff Rogg, whom I met at a conference at the Fort a few years ago. And we discovered that we had been trained by the same group of Quaker Jesuits. Jeff, I'm going to run through my questions, and they're really conversation starters. So please feel free to take them where you want. But I have to ask it first. You said in your book you wanted to be a fisherman, soldier, or lawyer when you were growing up. I see you went to law school, then you joined the military, but not as a JAG. Could you tell us a little bit about your choices here?
Sure. Thanks, Nick. Fishing's the only thing that stuck, by the way. Hopefully be doing more of that this weekend. So the answer to that question is in this room tonight. One of my good friends, buddy of 20 years from law school, Chris Pearson's here with his family, and Chris was a Marine intelligence officer, and I met him in law school, and he was transferring to the JAG Corps and had encouraged me to look at the JAG route. So I applied for the Army JAG Corps internship, and I was accepted for that my first year of law school, so between my first and second year of law school. And at the time, I joked that it was too much law, not enough Army. So careful what you wish for, because I got more of that and enlisted after law school. And that's actually where I met another friend who's in the audience tonight. And I was hurt in the same military course where we met and didn't know what I wanted to do afterwards. And so that same friend was attending Georgetown for undergrad. And I sort of had taken to academia, and I looked at Georgetown, and I went to the security studies program there, where I took my first intel course with Dr. Genevieve Lester, Jen Lester, who's also in the audience tonight. And so that's when I fell in love with intel. But I've always been a historian. I've been historically minded, and so I wasn't satisfied with just doing the master's. I applied to a PhD program, and something that we probably could talk about is there is no PhD in intelligence history. There's PhDs in military and diplomatic history, so that's what I did. That's where Nick enters the story, though. I met Nick at the Spy Museum in 2019, and I was sitting by myself downstairs for lunch, and Nick said, hey, why don't you come over and have lunch with me? And it was with you, Hayden Peak, a few others. And that was the start of one of our conversations. You read a paper that I wrote on the Cipher Bureau, the American Black Chamber. That was the proof of concept for the history that I did in the book. And Nick wrote me an email after he read that paper, and I still kept that email. And I look back on it from time to time, because Nick's email was one of the things that convinced me that I had a good idea and I could apply it, and I could be a historian. And so, again, the answer to that question is that journey from possibly going to the JAG Corps to here tonight. Sometimes I've wondered, what would have happened if I had done the JAG Corps? But sitting here tonight, and just so I think you probably know as an audience, for an intel historian, doing a book talk at the Spy Museum is an absolute dream come true. So I couldn't change anything based on that.
Great answer. Thanks, Jeff. So that's an easy segue to this particular book. a lot of us, when we write a first book, it's usually a modest thing based on a PhD thesis. This is an impressive debut, and I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about how you landed on this particular subject.
So the last course I took at Georgetown was a course on key problems in intelligence policy, and the professor was Burton Gerber. For those of you who don't know who Burton Gerber was, he spent almost 40 years in the CIA, and he unfortunately passed this past January. Otherwise, I had hoped he would be in the audience. But that's where I was looking at the class, and it was called Key Problems in Intelligence Policy. And I had already been familiar with civil-military relations as far as the theory and history of American civil-military relations. And I asked myself, well, why isn't there a complementary field of civil intelligence relations? Because the intelligence profession is different than the military profession. And that's something that always surprised me in the research, is how long it took to professionalize intelligence in this country. And I wrote that paper that I mentioned to you, Nick, on the Cipher Bureau, where I applied my ideas on civil intelligence relations to a specific case study, the Cipher Bureau at the American Black Chamber. It was a communications intelligence organization during the 1920s. Didn't make it that long. And what I found is that these ideas of civil intelligence relations actually help explain American intelligence history pretty well. And originally, when I framed it for a dissertation, I thought I would do a couple case studies. So Cipher Bureau, CIA, formation of NSA. But I noticed that there were certain recurrent themes that went further and further back. So I went further and further back. And eventually I was like, well, let's just start at the beginning of the American Revolution and work my way forward from there.
Okay, you're answering a lot of my questions before I even asked them. I guess that's a sign of good teamwork here. So when you've told us how you landed on this and how you went back to essentially day one, can you tell us a little more about how you went about your work? Were there any particular collections that you found more useful than others?
This is where I mentioned there were some students in the audience earlier from the Washington Center, and I had already credited Nick with my journey as an historian. Having good friends matters, and having collegial friends matters. And one of the things that I feel really thankful for, and again, the audience tonight attests to that, is the friends and colleagues that I've made. We're a fairly collegial group. And so Nick was very forthcoming and helpful with the research. I remember around the time that I'd met Nick, I was working on World War II in the OSS, and Nick told me, he's like, Bureau of Budget. Because the Bureau of Budget during the Second World War had knives out for the OSS. So they kept every, dirty thing that they could keep imaginable. So that was like a gold mine for my research. And so I really enjoyed, looking elsewhere than the files that you'd normally expect to find. And Nick put me on the right track with that. But a collection that I really have to mention is the Walter Forsheimer papers. For those of you who didn't know Walter Forsheimer, he was the CIA's first legislative counsel, and he had an incredible intelligence history collection. He supposedly had 2 condos at the Watergate Hotel, one for himself, Walter Forsheimer, and one for all his books and articles and letters. So just so you understand and appreciate this as an intelligence historian, where else would you open one box and find a letter from Cardinal Richelieu, a letter from George Washington, a spy game from 1898, and KGB medals? That's the Forsheimer collection. And there's another piece that I have in the book, and I'm very happy to share. So one thing that you always look for as a historian is something new that hasn't been found before. So I'm looking at Walter Forsheimer's papers, and this is pretty drudgery going paper by paper, and I find a sort of half cut out sheet. And it's a transcript of a phone conversation from, it said 1954, and it was scratched out to 1974. Presumably, it was between Walter Forsheimer, and the person he'd called was William Sullivan, who was associate director of the FBI under Hoover. He ran domestic intelligence, COINTELPRO. If you're not familiar with it, it was the FBI collection program, domestic collection program during the Cold War, got the FBI in a lot of trouble. And what it was concerning was a very particular moment that is important in American intelligence history. In February 1945, newspapers around the country ran a headline that said something to the extent of New Deal plans super spy system. New Deal was code for the FDR administration. It was written by a gentleman named Walter Troen. And there's a debate among intelligence historians over who leaked Donovan's plan for post-war intelligence to Trohan to leak to the American people. Now, Donovan blamed J. Edgar Hoover. And Nick, I don't want to get this wrong, but you said it was Steve Early and FDR?
I said it, probably Steve Early.
Probably
Not FBI.
But probably not FBI.
Yeah.
So Steve Early was FDR's press secretary, and the story there is that this was getting too big, and he didn't want to deal with it. Leak it to the American people. They're going to say no to a spy system, and Donovan in his steps. Well, according to the piece of paper that I found, Sullivan told Forsheimer it was Hoover, and that the FBI had hired Trohan's son, discovered he was homosexual, and then extorted Trohan to become Hoover's leaker. I shared this with Nick. I saw John Fox, the FBI historian who's in the room, and Bev Gage, who wrote that amazing book, G-Man, on J. Edgar Hoover, and none of them had heard this piece before. So am I saying that it's true? Not necessarily. Sullivan had an axe to grind against Hoover by this point in time, but for an intel historian, it just adds another piece to this puzzle of who leaked the Donovan plan.
All right. So I take it that would have been a high point of your research process. Are there any low points? Are there any times where you go, why am I doing this? Or, will this never end?
More than the high points, that's for sure. So it's funny that we mentioned, my path to being a historian. I don't give my law degree a lot of credit, but what it did is it gave me a background in legal research. And legal research includes going through legislative history. That is such a great resource for American intelligence history, but it is drudgery. I mean, it is boring, and especially the further you go back. So I was tracing legislative history, legislative debates over intelligence back to the first U.S. Congress, and having to look through these debates, and they don't talk about intelligence. A couple times they talk about spies, but usually it says, Secret Service or special agent or something not intelligence directly. So the low points were probably just pouring through these legislative debates. And word to the wise, I don't know how many aspiring intelligence historians, students are in the audience. Also keeping track of your sources, because when I wrote this, I didn't necessarily take good notes on the quotes or the names. And so when I had to make it a publishable book, I went back, and I must confess, and my editor is not here tonight, thankfully, but I had one representative's name wrong, like 6 drafts into the book, and I finally corrected it last October. So going through legislative history, low point, but absolutely necessary to writing the book.
Okay. And so one of the things I generally write one subject books, but I wrote during the COVID, I wrote a book about the origins of American intelligence in World War II, and there's a lot of stuff in there. And so when I go back and I handle that book, I go, how on earth did I get all these facts going more or less in the same direction? Can you tell us a little bit about your process of how you digested what you had found in research and how you harnessed it to your arguments?
That was very challenging for this book. It was hard to establish chronology and a framework. Again, that's where I think I was using ideas of civil intelligence relations. So I grouped most of my research around a couple core themes that I see reappearing and hopefully resonate with you today when you think about the American intelligence system. Politicization is a big one. And I mean that also in the sense of politicization of intelligence like analysis, but also intelligence involved in domestic partisan politics. Control. Who controls intelligence? Is it Congress? Is it the president? There were debates about that in the first part of the early American Republic. Control also in terms of key intelligence functions. That means who controls domestic intelligence. Very big deal during the First World War, and the FBI, the BOI, kind of comes out on top. And so that relates to control and bureaucratic competition. So competition over the intelligence system. And that helps explain the functional breakdown of the U.S. intelligence community today. And so I was looking at those key themes, and I'd mentioned this one too, professionalization. So why did it take so long to have a distinct, independent American intelligence profession? And essentially what I did is I looked for sources that corresponded with those themes. I found where they aligned chronologically in American intelligence history and built the book off of that.
Okay, great answer. Were there any surprises as you progressed that, apart from the ones that you've already mentioned?
Sure. I think one of the assumptions that I wanted to test, and this is one that I think we all sort of just instinctively hear about, it was recently written about, is that the American people are averse to intelligence, that the American people are suspicious of intelligence. I wanted to test that. So throughout the book, meaning from the earliest days of the American Republic, I was looking for evidence that the American people, as you can establish it, whether it's popular culture, newspapers. I have a newspaper from like 1802 with an op-ed written about secrecy in the government, polling, media, news, literature. What were they saying in response to intelligence? And what I found is that running assumption, the American people are generally fearful of intelligence, is true, except when they're scared. And that happens a lot in American history. And when they're scared, that's when they really love intelligence a little too much. And so you see these really drastic swings in American public opinion towards intelligence, or at least what the American people are willing to tolerate from intelligence. And so it's something that I guess just how entrenched that pattern has been was surprising. So I was surprised, but not surprised. Surprised that the American people, it's not that they're fearful of intelligence. We really like intelligence sometimes, but just how quickly we switch and vacillate between liking intelligence and not liking it, depending on how safe we feel.
Okay. So one of the things that struck me when I was looking at World War II is like the Brits don't seem to have had this conversation. Intelligence is just part of the furniture, and you don't talk about why it is or it isn't. It's just there. Whereas we seem to have this conversation over and over again in this country in one form or another. So speaking of which, I like to say that up to now, the best book about American intelligence, the best overall history of American intelligence, is written by a Brit, by Christopher Andrew, and it's for the President's Eyes Only. So, can you tell us a little bit about? And I know that there's another book that I haven't read yet. I'm honestly that has come out at the same time. So, what distinguishes you from the other books that have been written previously about this subject?
So I also haven't read Mark Lowenthal's new book. I have it at home
Brand
too.
new, right?
So that's brand new as well. We're probably going to have two very different frames of reference. He was an intelligence officer. I wasn't. But from Christopher Andrews' book, for the President's Eyes Only, first is he races through early American history. I mean, he goes from Washington to Teddy Roosevelt in one chapter, and then it's chapter by chapter through all the other presidents. I do think that's a mistake because you just miss a lot of key themes and controversies. The debates over Congress and the presidency in the early American Republic and intelligence oversight. I mean, this was a constitutional issue from the very beginning, the outset of the United States. You missed the creation of the first party system, which was in part due to the politicization of intelligence. You missed coordination issues during the Civil War that sort of provide an antecedent to the creation of the CIA. So that was the first thing, is just how quickly he goes through the early history. The other piece is it's called For the President's Eyes Only, and it's generally related to the relationship between intelligence and the presidential administration, including not just the president, but senior figures. I like to draw in more elements, including American civil society. Congress is a huge player in the book, the judiciary to some extent, the press. And so that I think is another distinction is, I'm very concerned with not just the relationship between intelligence within the executive branch and the presidency or the presidential administration, but intelligence with, we like to say like whole of government, whole of society, whole of nation.
So, what took us American intelligence officers and historians so long to write these books? The Republic's been here for almost 250 years, and this has been a subject that we have thought about and discussed. But up until this year and Chris's book, there really hasn't been very much by way of the overviews. Why did it take so long?
So, we can trace back, I guess, there were some attempts. G.J. O'Toole, that was a cover name, I believe, for a history of the United States that was dated to the late 80s, early 90s when it was first published. I think it went through a few iterations. It ends around the 70s with the Church Committee. There's been looks at American intelligence history using themes like espionage, famous cases throughout American history. I think, first of all, it's hard enough to write, and I say this as a historian. Do you know the looks that I got when it's like, what are you writing a book about? The history of American intelligence. It's hard to write a whole book like that. And to peel back, again, secrecy and declassification is an issue. There's more available today. To some extent, I actually think I wasn't as fundamentally concerned with some of those areas because it wasn't, the specifics of a particular intelligence operation that concerned me. It was more with high level, big picture, what is going on in American intelligence. So I think that made the work a little bit easier, perhaps in some ways. But also intelligence studies. Intelligence studies is a fairly recent field of study. I mentioned Jen Lester. I was able to study intelligence studies. I don't really know how else, unless you were exposed to that, you would go about examining intelligence history. So it's a combination, I found, and this is having a peculiar background because I wasn't just a historian in the sense of like BA, MA, PhD in history. Having the background in intelligence studies helped me when I combined it with military and diplomatic history and American political history, because I was able to recognize what was going on with intelligence as a specific function of national security in combination with areas like political history, diplomatic history, cultural history, military history. So I think part of it is just educational.
Okay. And a related question that you've touched on is the access to. So I've been an official historian and an unofficial historian who works for himself right now. So the assumption is when you're an official historian, you get access to all these wonderful documents and you can see things that others can't see. Can you comment on that? Are there things that you wanted to see but couldn't, or did you feel that you saw enough and could run with the ball?
There's always things you want to see. That's part of the reason I went into intelligence studies is it's just a cool area. Everyone always wonders, like, what is the CIA doing? What is the NSA doing? Do they listen to all of us? So there's always stuff you want to see. You have to be careful about going down research rabbit holes, as historians know. Again, I think that there were a couple areas that I wish, especially as you get more recently in intelligence history, that I had more access to. And even then, if I did, I wouldn't want to write about it because it never would get published. So that's the other obstacle too, is, very well, Nick, you are constrained based on your clearance about writing certain things. So that hampers public knowledge about intelligence. And I guess that's why I perhaps had an easier time writing the book, or at least it didn't bother me that much, is because I wanted to produce something that would explain to lay readers, starting out as a pillar, lay readers, just the origins and evolution of the American intelligence system. What do you need to know? How did we get to where we are today? What are the big themes? What are the controversies? What are the cyclical things that we keep seeing? How is the intelligence community structured? Why is it structured that way? And to do that, luckily, and I might get some hesitation from intelligence historians with access, I think you're able to do that without too much on the classified side.
So along that vein, who do you want your readers to be? Is there somebody out there or a group of people out there that you think, oh, this is for them, or these are the sort of people who should read this book?
So this was the biggest challenge by far, because I have friends in the intelligence community. Policymakers a little bit more distant, because I have friends who have never touched intelligence, never been in national security, never been in the military. I live where I grew up in Tampa, Florida, and my friends that I go fishing with often couldn't care less about intelligence, but I want them to understand intelligence. So I wanted to produce something that would provide knowledge for new knowledge in some ways for policymakers and practitioners. So I am an intelligence studies academic. I do contemporary national security oriented research and writing. So I am concerned with the practice of intelligence. So I wanted something that would resonate with policymakers and practitioners. I'm also a PhD in history, and in order to publish a book, you need to satisfy the other PhDs in history, including the reviewers. And so I needed good, solid primary source research. Like, I needed to be a good historian, and I needed to produce something that scholars and historians would say, this is new knowledge. But when it comes to who I want to read the book, who I think needs to understand intelligence most is, I say it at the end, it's not just a history of the spy and the state. It's a history of the spy, the state, and the American people. The vacillations that we see in intelligence, the hot and cold back and forth, doesn't serve the intelligence community well. It doesn't serve policymakers well, and it doesn't serve the country well. It's a big aspiration to reach lay readers. Every author wants to reach lay readers, but that's fundamentally the audience that I would want to read the book most, because intelligence, just, I think everyone here, since you're here tonight, you already appreciate this. I say this in the conclusion, the 21st century is going to be the most surveilled century in human history, and it's not even close. Intelligence is everywhere, private sector, public sector. Privacy is less and less existent. This affects all of us. And I know that intelligence officers and policymakers do think about it and are concerned about it. I know also that too many Americans just throw up their hands and say, what can I do about it? But I think what I've shown in different parts of the history is the American people, as a collective, a national collective, have shaped their intelligence system, like with that Donovan piece. Public outcry. Congress was appealing to the American people when they were debating the CIA. It can happen. It happened after 9/11, again, with the creation of the DNI. So I think that the American people need to be more involved in their intelligence system in the future than they have in the past. And that's another reason why I wrote the book and who the audience is.
Okay, your book includes the comment that intelligence is un-American. So can you riff off that? So how, if intelligence is un-American, how are you going to get people to go through the process you just described?
So the first time I wrote that, I didn't put any caveats in, and I think that I sent it to you for sure, because I was like, hey Nick, I need to know what you think about this, because I can just imagine my friends who were intelligence officers or in the intelligence community looking at it, and it's like, are you calling us un-American? So I added a very important stipulation that didn't appear in the recent article in The Atlantic, which is, intelligence by its nature is un-American. That's the point. That's why we have so much hesitation when it comes to intelligence. It doesn't mean the people who do it are, though. Some of the best Americans I know are intelligence officers. So but what they have to recognize, and this is a debate and it's a conversation that's important to have within the intelligence community, is just, as a friend of mine who's also in the audience said, know the game you're in. You are in a profession that, by its very nature, what it involves doing goes against the core of a lot of American principles. In some cases, in other countries at least, constitutional law, civil liberties. Be aware of that. Don't pretend that you're doing, I heard this, and this is why I wrote it in the book. Because a lot of times you'll hear public officials and members of the intelligence community say, don't worry, intelligence isn't un-American. And I think part of the reason they say that is because historically we've always done intelligence. Yes, I got that. But just because we do it doesn't mean it's who we are or our best aspirations as a people. And so I think it's important for intelligence officers to understand that the profession is essentially un-American. And that explains a lot of the tensions that they repeatedly see.
Okay, great answer. Thanks. And can you take that a little further and talk about any tensions between the intelligence community and the academic community?
So, it's fascinating, right? Because there was actually close proximity. I was at the Yale Club of New York last night talking about Yaleys who were involved in intelligence throughout American history. So not just like World War II, but Nathan Hale through nearly the present day. And so there was actually been a lot of close proximity between the intelligence community and academia for most of American intelligence history. Then there were some scandals. There's a big one about, the CIA. It was the CIA and the National Student Association, the NSA, during the 60s, an article produced about, the CIA is using American students as assets. And, I think that for colleagues in academia who aren't from intelligence studies, they aren't versed in intelligence history, a lot of those old biases still remain. I think that's changing today. The intelligence community recruits out of academia. When I was at the Citadel, I had, CIA officers who were recruiters come and say, can we speak to your class? I was more than happy to have them come speak to the class. You want the best and brightest. I will say, in order to repair that, though, this is where having academic historians who weren't in the intelligence community, it's like, I come in peace. So if you read my book, it might change your mind about your biases about the intelligence community. Nick, I would hope you would confirm this, but one of the difficulties I had is there's a tendency among academics, journalists as well, to be overcritical of the intelligence community and focus on the same scandals, MK Ultra, mind control, Bay of Pigs, covert action, mass surveillance. And then there's a tendency among intelligence officers to perhaps be overly defensive. And I think I was pretty fair calling balls and strikes with the intelligence community. Great boxing referee Joe Cortez used to say, I'm firm, but I'm fair. I think I was firm, but fair with the intelligence community in the book. And so hopefully academics can read it and gain a bit of a new appreciation for the IC.
So, by the way, is that your illustrations, I think, are terrific, and you've picked things that kind of epitomize what that boil down your arguments and make them fun and accessible. So that's one good reason to read this book is not only the text but also a lot of interesting visuals. Starting with George Washington, right? There's a little cartoon of George Washington, and isn't he at dinner reading an intel report? So let's see, what else do I have? So are there any trailblazers, men or women, whose examples that you came across and that you particularly admire or think have established a precedent that should be followed?
First, and I mean this sincerely, some of the people in this audience tonight, and you sharing the stage with me, that my friends in intelligence and national security helped keep my work grounded. I think there's a different, when I was speaking to the students earlier, it changes your perspective to know the people. And that's one of the difficulties that I think some academics have, is not knowing the people. Of course, you don't know everything. And one of my standing rules is don't tell me stuff I'm not supposed to know, but sort of, what the job entails, the separation from family, you hold your friends' kids and you know the danger they put themselves in. It changes your perspective when you start judging the intelligence community too harshly. And more particularly when, you do it, as I said, the American people tend to do in these very radical swings between hot and cold. And so I mean it sincerely when I say, my friends often are my heroes. And I remember when I'm writing the book, who the people are who are doing this. Reaching back into the history, though, there were some figures that I thought had outsized impact. A gentleman who I like, and one of the pictures, my favorite picture in the book, I'll tell you all, is the Bahama. It's a ship from 1862. It was a blockade runner. And at the time, the Confederacy, we were trying to blockade the Confederacy. And so a gentleman named Henry Shelton Sanford was officially the U.S. minister to Belgium, and unofficially, he was the Union spy master in Europe. And so one of his agents, they had to track blockade runners and try and intercept them and send the messages to the Navy Department. So here's a coordination issue for intelligence. And Sanford has an agent draw this beautiful picture of the Bahama in color. In the book, unfortunately, it's not in color. I have it in color, and I'm going to blow it up and put it up at home. But Sanford writes a letter. He's writing letters to William Seward, the Secretary of State. And one of the things that I found so fascinating is how keenly attuned he was to problems in intelligence, including intelligence coordination. Like, we're having trouble within the State Department. I'm competing with Charles Francis Adams, who was the ambassador to England at the time, and we're not talking to each other. And is this information getting to the Navy Department, the War Department? It's a coordination issue. And he's writing about this in 1862. And this is something that then a couple more people, Robert Lansing, the Secretary of State during the First World War, is writing to Woodrow Wilson saying, we need to coordinate American intelligence. So a lot of the histories begin, and I sort of joke about it, but in the beginning, the earth was void. And then Donovan comes around and says, let there be intelligence. And that's how a lot of intelligence history begins. But really, the coordination debate started much sooner. And so, there's a couple names in there that I think should have a little bit more purchase. And lastly, James Fenimore Cooper. He's known for the Leatherstocking's Tales, for Last of the Mohicans, great book and movie. But the book that launched him to fame was called The Spy. And it's arguably the world's first intelligence novel, where a spy is the main character. And what I loved about reading it is his source was John Jay. John Jay they were neighbors, and he told James Fenimore Cooper about intelligence operations during the American Revolution, because John Jay had done a lot, counterintelligence. He was on the Committee for Secret Correspondence. And the interesting thing is, Cooper tries to protect Jay's name, protect sources and methods. And Jay, in turn, tried to protect sources and methods, who his agent was. And so when you read The Spy, and I encourage you all to read it, I think it's a great piece of American literature that isn't well read or studied, because so much of what Cooper did outshines it now, but it launched him to fame. And you also see how the American people reacted to a spy being the hero and finding out that George Washington was involved in intelligence during the American Revolution. And so it wasn't just reading the book that I liked, but I read contemporary reviews of the book where some people were appalled that George Washington was ever cast as dealing with spies and espionage, or horrified that you could make a spy, this heroic figure. And that, again, attests to this long-running theme in American history of, how we just have this natural cultural aversion to intelligence. But I'd encourage you to read the book. And so James Fenimore Cooper, ahead of his time, I think he wrote a great piece of American literature, and it's about intelligence.
All right. So I'm getting to the end of my questions here, Jeff. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to talk about at this point?
I'm really excited for Q&A. Nick and I have had a lot of these conversations over the years, and like I said, as far as the integrity of the book, I want historians and practitioners like Nick, who actually isn't a practitioner historian, he has both hats, to pick up, read the book, and challenge me on it. But I'm eager to hear questions from the audience, because again, the book is really made for all readers, including lay Americans who just want to know what the heck is going on in our intelligence community.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Jeff.
Yeah, well, I'm going to invite anyone in the room who has a question to make their way over, and I will kick it off with one from online. Oh, Mark Stout's there. You talked about the heaviness of just actually doing some of the research, but what was the hardest thing for you to write about or research? Was there anything that was emotional or uncomfortable?
COVID was hard. When COVID hits, I think all historians, and this was fun. I know Mark knows this one too. So the CIA changed its website in, I think it was 2020, 2021. I used the CIA electronic reading room for a lot of my sources, and you have to footnote them, including the links. Well, when the CIA changed their webpage, all those links broke. And so suddenly I had to go backtrack, and find all these links and documents that I had lost. So I think when that moment happened, Mark might be one of them. If you listened closely, you'd hear the collective screams of thousands of intelligence historians. Like, why would the CIA do this to us? Maybe that's their best conspiracy, right? Is like, we're going to break it so no one can dig into our history anymore. So that was aggravating, actually.
I love that. But I think what they wanted to know was there anything emotional, like any subject matter?
Okay, so I think the hardest...
So I liked hearing about the collective size of all the intelligence historians.
Yeah, commiserate with us. The hardest was treating contemporary times, because everyone... Again, I tried to be as fair as possible, and no one's going to be happy with that. I might tell you ahead of time. Like, we live in a polarized world where you have to pick a side, and, I don't fall into the whole Aristotelian, like, you have to pick a side. I had to treat the politicization of the intelligence community in recent years, internally and externally. The idea of the deep state, the presidential administration and relationship with the intelligence community. That is such a hot button issue. It intimately involves friends of mine in the intelligence community, academics. Everyone has very passionate views on this generally. And I really can say I did my best to treat it as academically as possible in terms of, what does the history tell me about earlier episodes of politicization? And then what does my own creative foundation in civil intelligence relations suggest as far as best practices? But that's the most difficult, because those are the conversations that, I'm willing to have. I shouldn't be up here if I'm not willing to have them, but they're the toughest ones to have, because everyone's so passionate about it, and it involves people who you really like and care about, from different perspectives being tugged both ways. So that was absolutely the hardest part.
Well, I was in a really good mood until you mentioned what the CIA did to their website, and now I'm filled with seething rage. But I'll try and concentrate. So, thinking about the George Washington through James Buchanan administrations, how much continuity do you see from administration to administration in things like organization, personnel concepts, or civ intel relations, or was each one kind of making this up from scratch when it came to office?
So I look at that in terms of, this is, I guess, more of the Christopher Anders side in terms of the relationship between the administration and the intelligence community. What I was focused on was the relationship between the Congress, the president, and the intelligence community, because you see this pull where in 1790, Congress creates what's called the Contingent Fund for Foreign Intercourse at Washington's request. He asked for it in his first address to Congress. We call it the State of the Union today. I need a special fund for the conduct of foreign relations. And everyone pretty much knew very quickly that it meant secret services. That was code for spying and espionage. And within about 20 years, everyone's saying this is what it means for spies. And they started calling it the Secret Service Fund. But what I found was Congress gives it to Washington very quickly. And they also are like, don't worry about telling us what you're doing with it. But this was George Washington we're talking about. And so he occupied a very special place at the time, at least in terms of unifying a country that was fractious. I mean, this is the creation of the first party system. By the time he leaves office, even then, there are hackles being raised in Congress about George Washington. But by the time you get to the Adams administration, you start to see controversies involving intelligence and Congress debating them, executive prerogatives dealing with intelligence. And it just keeps picking up. And so this is covered in chapter 4, but the strenuous debates in Congress over intelligence. I mean, that's what these debates were about, spying and intelligence. Should the U.S. do it? Who should be in charge? Should the president have to report to Congress or not? In multiple administrations, you saw these questions. And so that might not be as complete an answer as you wanted, Mark, but basically that was what concerned me most, is the place of intelligence in our constitutional system. And I think something that sort of has been overlooked by most of the history on it is that Congress was debating the role of intelligence in a constitutional republic. So it wasn't like people ignored intelligence. They knew they were talking about spies and espionage.
All right. Thank you for your talk, and really have enjoyed the book, parts that I've gotten through, and look forward to the rest of it. But jumping off from where you left off, the role, kind of the resolution where America vacillates between one or the other. You mentioned the hyper surveillance state that we're entering in, the ubiquity of technology. Based on your historical read, where we've come from, how long it's taken us to get here. You mentioned the professionalization. Where are we in your estimation? And what are the major, let's call them functional components that at this stage are lagging? Are they 10 years behind? Are they 20? Have we made advancements that have kind of shaped this better for the future? Or are we in a different position? Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. So I treat intelligence looking forward in the conclusion. So it's a bit of, I had Nick read the conclusion. It's a bit of an unconventional or unorthodox conclusion for a history book because it's actually forward looking. So like I said, the 21st century is going to be the most surveilled century in human history. One of the things that concerned me is when the capabilities and technology outpace, and this is where I do use my law degree, outpace constitutional law. We saw that in 2001. After 9/11, the NSA had capabilities that when Congress created FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in the 70s, they couldn't contemplate. And so the NSA felt compelled to leverage those capabilities very quickly. In fact, arguably, even before the president fully knew what it was, the president signs a finding a couple weeks after the NSA starts doing these operations. Everyone's scared. And by the way, this is where I'll say the American people were telling everyone, don't let us get attacked again. So, there's really an impetus here. But again, so President Bush signs a finding, and eventually this program, and it was it's called the President Surveillance Program. I read the PSP. I read the 800-page IG report, so you all don't have to. I have my biases, but I tried to translate it into civil intelligence relations. But it became what we called, warrantless surveillance. Americans intentionally or unintentionally swept up in massive surveillance. And what surprised and somewhat alarmed me is when a series of controversies involving intelligence during the global war on terror started, the dominoes started falling. So, we heard about warrantless surveillance, enhanced interrogation techniques, black sites, really controversial stuff. There was a bit of a reaction, but not that massive a reaction. I would have expected more like something along the 70s. And the other interesting thing was Congress then took the President's surveillance program, repackaged some of the programs in the FISA Amendment Acts of 2008. And the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISC itself, also giving judicial review, so judicial approval to certain types of surveillance. You see a unanimity among the three branches of government that we hope are in competition to basically repackage surveillance because it's an important national security function. We saw this recently. If those of you were paying attention to the debate of Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Amendment Acts, intelligence professionals will tell you it is very important for national security, and then they'll say, "Trust me." That's a problem. If you can't say why, it's not going to work. And it gets even worse because we also have a FISC review telling you all the times the FBI actually abused this Section 702 of FISA. So, if you want the American people to get behind, a surveillance program, probably you shouldn't abuse it and then make the compelling argument, well, this is very important for national security. I know I'm using the history. This is what historians do. We use the history to frame the future. So I'm concerned that technology is outpacing constitutional law. I mean, we are so far away from what the founders would have ever envisioned, never mind what Mao or Stalin would have envisioned as capabilities. Are we going to be able to preserve shreds of our civil liberties, of what we consider the American way of life, how most of us in the audience grew up? Is the future going to look anything like that? And one of the concerns is, we haven't talked about this, it's the spy and the state, the history of American intelligence, but we're in a contested intelligence environment. So the IC is in competition with private sector companies, nation states, non-state actors. That competition means that you're probably going to be more assertive, aggressive, intrusive. And again, like I said, when the American people feel threatened, when you can make the case, you should be afraid, give us this power, you're going to cede rights. And, it's kind of like this is what the founders understood. When you give the government certain powers, they don't really give them back. And same thing with intelligence. Once you create an intelligence capability, the knowledge is there and the potential for abuse is there. And so what I say in the conclusion, again, sharing to some extent with the audience tonight, is I'm calling this the intelligence revolution. It's based off military history, the military revolution. That intelligence is in a new place that it's, and I say this as a historian, we don't like saying things are new, but in a place it's never been in human history. Like the military revolution in early modern Europe put countries in a place they'd never been in militarily before. I think intelligence is doing that today. And the problem with that is, any one person, your lifetime, you're not going to know what the full effects of that are. So the best that I can do is record the past, look for certain patterns, and then say, and now knowing that, how do you want to progress into the future with technology, politicization, control of the intelligence community, the distribution between the Defense Department's control over intelligence and civilian intelligence components. Based on that, and this is where the policymaker is important to read the book, what do you want to do? What do you want to legislate? How do you want to divide the intelligence community? How do you want to reform it? So I hope that begins to address what the greatest challenge. Again, I say this as an intelligence historian, so I'm biased, but I think one of the greatest challenges to the American way of life today.
I want to give some love to our online audience. Here's a tiny, tiny question. What is the biggest achievement of American intelligence, and what is the biggest failure?
Oh, yeah, a small question. Oh boy, because the tough one there is, do you think about a particular operation or a particular controversy? Biggest achievement in American intelligence history. I mean, this is where we're talking about like intelligence coups, like the Zimmerman telegram or something, and entering a war. I don't like giving generic or cliched answers, but I suppose the biggest achievement would be that it's grown so much and gotten so ornate for a country that has consistently expressed its aversion to intelligence over the course of history, to have the incredibly large intelligence community we have today. When I see so many points in time where Americans are saying we don't need another organization, we don't want spying, why are we? It's the fact that it's grown so much. I mean, I don't know if this is bureaucracy run amok in some ways, or the American we have an inclination towards technology, and as you develop new intelligence capabilities, you need a new organization, so the IC expands. But it's in some ways surprising and not surprising that our intelligence community is as massive as it is today for a population that so often will try and put the brakes on it. I that's probably not the answer a lot of you expected, and I hope not, because I do aim to surprise. As far as the worst piece, and this is what I'm going to go back to again, is it's controversial. I'm here to talk about it. Intelligence and politics. Intelligence has gotten involved in American politics at different points in history for different intentions, well-intentioned or not. It helped create the bitterness during the first party system. I mentioned this, many people don't realize, but Alan Pinkerton, the famous spy during the American Civil War, spied on Abraham Lincoln for George McClellan, General McClellan, who eventually became Lincoln's political opponent. Supposedly, another contemporary of his, Lafayette Baker, spied on Andrew Johnson, not a very popular president, by the way. But, during the first decade of the 20th century, Congress discovered that the Secret Service had been spying on certain members of Congress on behalf of the Roosevelt administration, looking for impropriety and looking for fraud. The problem is every time you have these episodes, I mean, just the partisanship, the polarization, the damage is worse. And so again, this is something that I feel compelled to go back to, because I'm speaking in contemporary terms as an intelligence historian, and these patterns keep happening in American history. These episodes of partisanship involving intelligence don't serve the intelligence community well. They don't serve the government and national security well, and they definitely don't serve the country well. Just a historian's take on it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed the talk a lot, and I'm going to grab a coffee later. I was wondering, could you talk us through some noteworthy women you came across, like related to the spy, the state, or the citizenry?
Absolutely. And this is important. I'm glad you mentioned women. I mentioned this in the introduction to the book. It's going to be entirely insufficient. It was hard to write a book focused on explaining the evolution of American intelligence at the big picture level, because, again, I say this in the intro, the intelligence community has generally only been as representative as the American government has been throughout history. And for many points in our history, that hasn't been very representative. It doesn't mean that there weren't women who were intelligence officers throughout American history. I don't really talk much about the Culper Ring, but there were women who were involved in collecting intelligence and supporting the Culper Ring, which went undiscovered for 5 years, which I think is a fairly remarkable accomplishment at the time. During the American Civil War, in Forsheimer's papers, there were both Confederate female spies and Union female spies who actually Alan Pinkerton says in his memoir he liked using women for certain missions because they could do things men couldn't. Nick and I talked about, there's a great book by Liza Mundy called Code Girls. Women like Elizabeth Friedman were pioneers in cryptanalysis or cryptology, in some ways more so than men were. Elizabeth Friedman got her husband, William Friedman, involved in cryptology to begin with. I guess the problem that I would go to in terms of what I hit is, episodically, there were women who were influential in intelligence history. A lot of the history, though, isn't representative when you talk about national intelligence policy. And, I can't help when I tackle the legislative debates that the member of Congress is a man and he's talking to a male DCI or a male director of the NSA. I mean, we are in a different place in intelligence today. It's still not as representative as other elements of the American government. I think that's changing, with good reason. I'd point you to, there was a great op-ed written, or article written in the New York Times, might be today or yesterday, about diversity in the U.S. intelligence community. And so one of the absolute shortcomings that I guess I would say in the book, but it's a shortcoming of American intelligence history, is it's not a representative history. unfortunately. And you can try and make it as representative as possible. But that was something that I really struggled with writing the book, is because I'm looking at, legislative creation of intelligence organizations, and it's not very representative. And so that again goes to why it's the spy, the state, and the American people, because we will get out of the intelligence community what we demand of it. And I think that's actually changed in recent years.
Hi. Lovely talk. Love this. Thank you very much. I'm going to take us back even further into history. So Nick mentioned that the British intelligence is part of the furniture. Is that how you phrase it? Yeah, right. So I'm just interested to see or to hear to what extent did the way that the Brits did the intelligence impact the discussion in Congress, if at all? And I mean, essentially, they would have had spies and they would have been told what was going on, and whether you had a chance to pursue these records that might have been available on the British side of things as this was developing.
I didn't have the chance. I would have loved the chance to go over to the UK. So, first of all, there is absolutely an intellectual legacy in this country that stems from the Brits. They're our cousins, and as Nick knows and wrote about it a lot in his book, the relationship between the British intelligence community and the U.S. intelligence community during World War II, and how the British tried to steer American intelligence, didn't always succeed, and in other ways did steer some evolutions in American intelligence. But one thing that was interesting to me is the British Parliament had their own sort of contingent fund, Secret Service fund, that I believe our founders perhaps were aware of or would have knew of when they legislated our own. That might be the case. It's a little bit hard to document, because no one said, well, let's copy the Brits and do the Secret Service stuff. But I did also see that there were, at different points during different wars, British influence in terms of they were competitors to us, actually, in the early history. And one of the things that we were worried about was British spies. And particularly during the first decade of the American constitutional system, there was the fear of British and French spies, and especially the Democratic Republicans, that was Jefferson's party, were fearful of British Secret Service influence. The Brits had a notorious Secret Service that they thought was spending a lot of money influencing American elections, American politicians. Again, this is in the 1790s. So conspiracy, collusion, etc., with foreign governments goes way back. And one of the other noteworthy episodes that I like is something called the John Henry Affair, where there was a American, he was Irish American, moved to Canada. Then he spied for the British and tried to spy on the Federalists and sold his papers to the Madison administration for the entirety of the Secret Service Fund, $50,000 at the time, which is, the money of a warship during the War of 1812. We needed that warship more than we needed political intelligence. And so the rancor that this caused in Congress over British spy, it's kind of like this. I call it the first dossier, because it's kind of like the Steele dossier. Disaffected British spy gets involved in American politics, doesn't end well for the United States. There's historical antecedents there. So again, all of that is to say, I didn't get a chance to go to the UK. Part of that is, my own failing in fundings as a PhD student too. I will say though, I don't think in the early history, it would have moved the needle as much. I think you see more British influence in the First World War, in the Second World War, and then certainly with the cementing of the special relationship, and as Nick pointed out, American cryptology and signals intelligence. That's where you see, a much more a bigger conversation between the two intelligence communities.
All right, we'll let you ask the last question.
Thank you so much for a great talk. A lighthearted pushback on intelligence not being American. I think the American Revolution perhaps you could argue that it began with a spy in Boston who signaled to Prescott, Dawes, and Revere and provided early warning to our forces of enemy intentions. But I think your point is well taken. Doug Porch's book on the French Secret Services utterly shocked me with how the French intelligence services were used by every different political party and level of government to advance their own agenda, sometimes, at the detriment of the French nation itself. But my question is, within the intelligence community, we serve the consumer. Is there any particular presidents you came across, particularly maybe outside of wartime presidents, who were better consumers of intelligence than others?
Oh, great question with presidencies. This is, Christopher Andrew writes this book on the relationship between intelligence community and presidents. Nick and I talk about this. So there were presidents who were more involved in intelligence and less involved in intelligence. George Washington was keenly involved in it, and he took his experiences. Then I think you do really see a lull in presidents who were very involved in it. It probably was owing to George Washington's experience during the American Revolution handling spies. You don't really see that same level of experience with anyone who was elected president long after. Abraham Lincoln, not so much. He had a lot to manage, and he was a bit of a micromanager too. But he did get involved, I found this was interesting, through Thurlow Weed with influencing the press. So propaganda, that's an intelligence function. He was very concerned with public opinion. Woodrow Wilson was a big failure. I mentioned this already because he had principles. He had people in his cabinet telling him, he had Lansing and William McAdoo telling him, we need to coordinate this. And then he had bitter rivalries between McAdoo and Thomas Watt Gregory, the Attorney General, over intelligence, and he didn't do anything to resolve that tension. And then after the war, he gives this great speech where he talks about now's the time for intelligence because we found out the Germans were doing it, but he didn't do anything to change it. Then FDR comes along, and FDR, and Nick and I actually, when you talk about friendly disagreements, disagree over how involved FDR was, but whether FDR intended to be really involved in intelligence or not, he was. And he was disruptive because of the positions that he assigned people. Donovan, for instance, the influence that he gave J. Edgar Hoover before the Second World War. Maybe it was due to his mischievous nature. Nick, do you want to swoop in on that so we can have this polite disagreement? Because I think FDR was very involved in intelligence. Nick thinks he thought it was more of a side. I don't want to miscast your ideas, but more of a sideshow.
I think I quote myself. FDR was bad at organized intelligence. He was the kind of guy who liked gossip. He liked tidbits that he could use. He liked personal relationships. So I'm going to revise slightly what you said and say that FDR was a he himself said he doesn't let his left hand know what his right hand's doing. And that was his approach to intelligence as well as other fields of policy.
And I'd also say David Priest wrote a great book on the President's Book of Secrets on the PDB, and he talks about the relationship between different presidents and the PDB, at least for intelligence. All of that is to say, great final answer is I have different beliefs on this, but there is some really amazing intelligence historians that also can provide some, great answers to that question, including Christopher Andrew. I mean, you should read For the President's Eyes Only too, and hopefully my book. I have to say that right.
I feel like all the intelligence historians gave a sigh of joy as opposed to the sadness they had about the CIA website. What a wonderful conversation and wonderful answers to questions. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Jeff, so much. Please check our website. We have lots of live and virtual events coming up. Thanks, everyone.